This conference will now be recorded.
All right. So if you want to get started, Myra, we're good to go.
Perfect. And I know we'll probably have some people continuing to join. But yes, thank you everyone for being here virtually, and thank you to Alyssa for the invitation and putting this together for you all. Originally we were going to do this in person, so it'll probably been a different vibe for you all, but we're all aware that we're in the midst of a pandemic. So we've all had to make adjustments, but hopefully this also makes it a little more accessible for everyone, and you can do this from the comfort of your home and not have to worry about driving or traffic or any of that. So there are positives there. But my name is Myra. I'm with Catalyst Miami. We're a local nonprofit down in Miami-Dade County. We do a bunch of different work. We provide direct services to people, like financial help and tax prep, do a lot of credit building work. We also do some work around healthcare access and helping people navigate those really confusing systems sometimes. And then we also do a lot of policy and engagement work. So that's where I fall under as the climate resilience program manager for the organization. So we do work around climate resilience and really looking at it from different points of view, really, leading from a point of view where we know that this is a really complicated and intersectional issue. So we'll get into that a bit more throughout the conversation. But just wanted to give you kind of like a broad overview of who we are, why in the world am I talking to you today. I do work on these issues day in and day out. Alyssa does too, of course. And yeah, we're just here to provide some more information. We know that right now this is probably, it may or may not be a timely conversation. We did just have, we were talking about tropical storm / Hurricane Isaias. And we're in the middle of hurricane season. It's been hotter than usual, I would say. I don't know if any of you all have felt that way, have noticed your utility bills go up maybe. I know I definitely have. They've been a lot higher than in years past. And yeah, we're in the middle of a pandemic. So when we talk about resilience, that's really all of it, thinking about our health, the way we live, our environment, what we're doing to it to make it better or not. So yeah, that just gives you a bit more context about what we'll be discussing. And I just really want to encourage everyone to, speak up if I ask any questions, or if there's like a story, or maybe there's something you've seen or noticed. We really want this to be a great learning environment for everyone, and all of your lived experiences are really worthy of bringing up during this discussion. So hopefully it'll be fruitful, hopefully it'll be meaningful, and I just really welcome this environment to be really as conversational as possible. So don't be scared to speak up. And yeah, that's the ground rules for me. So we'll get started and start the presentation officially. I know some more people have jumped on now, so you haven't missed too much. So yeah, Catalyst Miami. I like starting off with this slide just because I think it's important to show everyone that there's numerous organizations. A lot of these are Miami-Dade based, since that's who I typically work with. But in case you're wondering, like, are there other groups that are working on this? Is it just us? It's definitely not just Catalyst. There's schools, there's institutions like the Florida Institute for Health Innovation, New Florida Majority, which they do have organizers, for example, in Broward. There's the Southeast Florida Regional Compact on Climate Change that I'll talk about later. So just to kind of ground us all in realizing that this is a really big issue, and it takes definitely more than just like one group, one city. It takes a lot of us to work on these issues. So just like starting off with this PowerPoint with this slide, just to show that there's many groups working on this from different angles. We can move on to the next slide. So what is climate change? So I'm sure you're asking yourself that question right now. That's part of the reason why you're here. So yeah, I will explain that and just ground us all in knowing what it means. Some of you, it might be familiar. For some of you, this might be something new. So this just helps us all to know where we're starting from when we discuss climate change. So this is just helpful in case these terms come up throughout the entirety of the workshop, but AGW, that stands for anthropogenic global warming. So anthropogenic, really what that means that it's like humans, it's caused by humans. And we'll talk about this later, you know, the whole argument that it's not human caused, so humans aren't the leading cause for climate change. But know that there is a term to describe that. It's anthropogenic global warming. There's greenhouse gases or GHGs. You might have seen that around. So that's just shorthand for greenhouse gases, which we'll talk about in a little bit. CO2, so that's carbon dioxide. That's a specific greenhouse gas that we'll definitely talk about a lot. And I'm sure you've heard a lot of people mention carbon dioxide as part of the issue. There's also ppm, or parts per million. And basically that's just like a way of quantifying how much like CO2 there is in the atmosphere, how much of these gases there are. Because you can imagine, you know, we can measure liquids by like, you know, gallons or liters or whatnot. So it's the same way for quantifying how many gases there are. Gases are tiny little particles, so that's why we have to go up to like parts per million, because there's just so many of them in the atmosphere. Also, at any point, if anyone has any questions, I didn't mention that, but please feel free to unmute yourselves, and I'm happy to answer any, and I'm sure Alyssa is too, in case I can't answer a specific question to Hallandale Beach. SLR, that's probably one that you might be more familiar with given where you all live and some of the issues that you've been facing, but that's shorthand for sea level rise, and we'll definitely talk about that and why that's happening. Fossil fuels, so that typically refers to like oil, coal, and gas. So it's those fuels that we're extracting from the earth in order to typically, you know, run our electricity, if we're not able to do that from renewable energy sources like solar panels, for example, or wind. And then the last one is IPCC. It won't come up too much in this presentation, but I think it's just helpful for people to be aware that there is this intergovernmental panel. So there's researchers and scientists, really smart people from across multiple governments from across the world that are part of the IPCC, and that, you know, it's really their job to take a look at all the research, to really distill it and figure out like, what does this mean for the world? Like, what does what's going to happen in terms of climate change impacts for everyone? So there is a group that's tasked with that, and they're you know, nonpartisan, like they're not led by like political beliefs. It purely comes down to the science when they release their projections. So hopefully that kind of helps everyone in just figuring out some of the lingo and jargon that maybe you've seen before but didn't know what it meant exactly. So first, is there anyone that can explain what the greenhouse gas effect is that wants to take a shot at it? You can just unmute yourself. I'm warming you guys up for conversation for later.
I know Alyssa's dying to answer.
I'm trying to take a step back, Kathy.
I know.
Perhaps the way that I've been describing it hasn't always been the best, so I'd like to hear Myra describe it so I can improve my communication.
Agreed.
But Kathy, do you want to take a stab at it?
Oh no, I was prompting Alyssa because she's our resident expert.
Let's see, I see Faith, you unmuted yourself.
Yeah, I have no clue. I want to say a very ignorant guess is just the natural effects of living. I really don't know what greenhouse is. Growing things, animals, farms. I really don't know. I have no clue. So
I love that. I think it's important to name the things that we don't know and be comfortable with that. And it's not ignorant in any way, shape, or form. Not at all. But yeah, no, thank you for being here. You're about to learn in a second. So with no other takers, so the way we like to describe it is there's like an easy way that we like to use. So, you know, you see the Earth, you see the picture of the Earth here, and then you see that there's like O3, CO2, H2O, the greenhouse gases that I mentioned before, that they're in like the gray part of the picture. So we do need the greenhouse gas effect to live a comfortable life. So imagine, you're in your house, you have the AC on, you feel comfortable, you feel cool, you go to bed, and let's say you just have like a blanket on just because, you have the AC a bit lower than usual, so you're able to sleep comfortably. So that's basically what like the greenhouse gas effect does. Like it keeps us warm, we're able to live comfortably, we're able to grow things, we're able to thrive and survive and, have water, have all the things that we need. But imagine that, for whatever reason, someone decides to throw on like another blanket on you, but you've kept the temperature the same way, your AC the same temperature. And then someone else adds another one, and then another one, and soon you have like 10 blankets on you. You're probably going to start to feel pretty miserable if you haven't, compensated for that with your AC temp. So basically that's what's happening with the Earth in like very simple terms, is that you do have greenhouse gases that we do need to survive. Like you do need like a blanket usually to go to bed. I mean, some people don't, but let's just go with the example here. And so what we've been doing is that when we're, pumping out these like greenhouse gases, they get trapped within the atmosphere. So that gray part that you see like the sun is bearing down on the Earth, which we do want some of that because otherwise we'd be like an icy, unlivable planet, which is not great for anyone. But with the greenhouse gas effect, I think oftentimes people say too much of anything is bad for you. So this is one of those cases where too much of these greenhouse gases, it is a bad thing for us because then we start to warm up the planet in a way that then tends to have really negative impacts at times, which we'll talk about later. So that's usually how I like to describe it. It's like you can use blankets, you can use sweaters or things that we don't typically use now, right? I know that I've talked to people who've lived in South Florida for several years, and in the past they've mentioned how, they were able to use winter gear or something close to it, and now I'm sure none of us, like this past winter, that wasn't really the case. So that's just like some of the ways that this plays out with the greenhouse gas effect. It's basically like a positive feedback loop if you heard that terminology used before. Does anyone have any questions around that? Faith, does that kind of help you a bit more to have like a better sense of what the greenhouse gas effect is and what it does?
Yeah, a little bit.
Do you have any questions? Anything to help clarify?
No, I think that's good. Thank you.
Myra, can I describe the greenhouse in the greenhouse metaphor?
Mm-hmm.
I'll do it really quick. So it's called the greenhouse gas effect. Well, greenhouse. So think about it. Imagine you're in Vermont and it's winter. If you want to still be able to grow food, you probably have a greenhouse, which allows it to stay warmer than the outside conditions because the glass basically traps the heat. Think of the glass as the same thing as the atmosphere. It's trapping the heat and keeping the conditions warmer than what would otherwise be there. And Myra's totally right. We do need the greenhouse effect to have a habitable planet. But if we add too much heat, too many blankets, too thick of a pane of glass in the greenhouse, it gets too hot for comfort and too hot for life in some conditions.
Yeah, that's perfect. Yeah, I think there's a lot of different ways to describe it. So whatever sticks out for you, whichever way it helps you to think about it, you can just keep that moving forward. Yeah, hopefully that gives a little more clarification. So when you hear people talk about that, that's what they're talking about. But typically now we tend to talk about it in the sense of like it's causing climate change. So we talk about it in really negative terms. But I think it is important to recognize that we do need some of it in order for us to be planet Earth and to be livable. There's a reason why there's only one Earth that we know of, at least, and can't live on other planets right now. Perfect. So we'll keep moving forward. So we're gonna start to get more into, okay, so how does this like play out on our planet? What kinds of impacts does this have? The fact that we have warming waters, for example, what are the real life impacts that we're feeling from that? So we'll talk about that now in this next segment. So one of the ways that that's playing out is that, our Earth, it's covered mostly by blue water. And another, I I guess like analogy we like to use to describe this is that, you know, when you're boiling a pot of water, for example, and you let it go for too long, it boils over. So what's happening with that pot of water as, you know, you're heating it up is that it's expanding. When things get hotter, the molecules tend to expand. Kind of think back to like, I don't know, high school science or middle school science when we talk about how heat or like the cool can impact molecules. So you're boiling something up, it's expanding, that's why it can boil over. So imagine our Earth in the same way and our oceans. So we discussed that we have the greenhouse gases are being trapped, it's leading to a warmer atmosphere. So, you know, you have the sun, it's bearing down our oceans, and because of the property of water, you know, it's heating up. And so you can see in this graph that a lot of the warming that we're really feeling when we're talking about it is our ocean. So if you think about like when you're out and about, let's say right now, you know, it's, at least for us, I know it's like, feels like in the 90s. If you were out wearing a black t-shirt, black dress, whatever it is, versus like a white t-shirt or a white dress, whatever it is, you're probably going to feel more comfortable in the white t-shirt because that's not, you know, soaking up the sun as much as the black shirt. Or like if you're walking out like on asphalt, black asphalt, you can probably feel that heat radiating. So the ocean, it acts in a similar way because of the color and stuff. Like it can soak up a lot of that heat. And so those are like some of the reasons why we're seeing the warming happen more like on our ocean than our lands. So we'll go to the next slide. So this is one of the ways that we're seeing this impact. So this is a picture of Greenland. So there, you know, like over there's like massive ice sheets. And you can see that over time, so the first picture is from 1979. And then you can see from September 2012 that the difference is pretty large when you see how much ice has melted. So because of the heat and that we're experiencing, the trapping that's happening, it's starting to cause our ice to melt. It's like anything else, you know, if you were to heat up ice cube, you know, it would start to melt away. So that's what we're seeing, and that's definitely contributing to some of the sea level rise that we're feeling now, especially here in Florida. Go on to the next one. So it's just another way of looking at it. So this is looking in particular at the way that the ice is melting from underneath. So if you see over time, the first picture, I know it's hard to see, it's the year says 2004, and then the last one at the very end is 2013. So you can see that over time, when you look at it from like underneath, that the ice has been melting. So the darker parts are parts that have been melting off over time. So if you look at it from that view as well, from underneath versus, you know, an aerial view, we can also see that there's been a massive amount of loss for this particular ice sheet in our world. So, kind of like summarizing all of this, the big picture, like one of the biggest takeaways you should have from this whole workshop is that we're releasing too much CO2 or like other greenhouse gases. And because of that, we're trapping a lot of heat within our atmosphere. So that's leading to, you know, the greenhouse gas effect, you know, having this major impact on our world. And our oceans are absorbing a lot of that heat, and that's causing thermal expansion. So what I mentioned before is that like the molecules are expanding. So that's a way of describing that phenomenon is thermal expansion, and that our ice is melting. So those two things combined, the ice melting and then like the water molecules expanding, that's the reason why we're seeing sea level rise happen, especially here in Florida. Any questions around that? Because that's probably like, if you walk away with that, anything else besides like knowing this is probably the biggest thing that you should remember from this workshop. So if you have any confusion about that, this is a great time to bring that up. Okay, I'm going to assume all of you all can now regurgitate what the greenhouse gas effect is. So I'll leave it to Alyssa to quiz you all later. So I'm sure that some of you have heard this before, but climate change isn't real, or humans aren't the cause of climate change. It's a natural occurring thing. Like, we're not making it worse. It's just something that's naturally happening in our world. So I have some counter arguments to that, or some ways to kind of disprove that if that ever happens to you. So we'll go on to the next slide. So these are some of the things that I've definitely heard before that have come up, or like excuses that people use to explain away what's happening. So there are like natural things that do happen that do tend to change like our climate a little bit. So one thing is solar activity. This is a really awesome picture, but our sun has solar flares that come off. And so when that happens, like they can measure that there is like that the sun basically gets hotter, or like that we're feeling the impacts of it, but it's super, super minute compared to the experiences that we're having from climate change. So that's one thing that you might hear, but it's really minor, like it's like a blip basically. There's also major volcanic eruption. So I know this has been used before. So, like if a volcano is to go off, there's a lot of ash that comes out, and it can turn, like any city where this is happening, any area, it can basically form clouds and you can't see anything. It's hard for the sunlight to get through. And so it can get like theoretically a little cooler because we're blocking the sun. But even then, like how many times are volcanoes going off in our world? Not very often enough for that to be a reason why like sometimes we have much cooler winters, for example. That's not why. Then the last thing is that our Earth does tend to change its orbit or tilt a little bit. So sometimes it happens, or like we're tilting a certain way, and so maybe we'll be closer to the sun or further away from it. But still, once again, it's so minor that when you look at all the impacts that we're talking about that are global now at this point, even if you were to combine like solar activity, the eruptions, and the tilts that we have, it still doesn't explain the major shifts that we're seeing around the world. So if that ever comes up, that's what I would say. Like even then, like yes, these are things that definitely happen. You can't explain away all the major changes that we're seeing. And then another way of like, showing how this happens, not just a fluke, we're not just like making up these numbers, is that you do have scientists that go out into like our ice sheets. This is a picture of a researcher who is getting an ice core from Antarctica. So they have these really awesome drills that go super deep into the ice sheets. And basically they are able to cut this up into little pieces. You see a little picture of someone holding up like a little slice of ice. So you can see that there's like little bubbles. So those little dots that you see are bubbles of gases that have been trapped over time in the ice sheets. So basically the further you go down into the ice, that's basically like a snapshot further and further off, like years and years and years and years ago. So it's a really cool way of kind of tracking our change over time. So the deeper you go in, the older that ice little chunk is basically. So that's one way that we've been able to see that if we compare where we were, years ago, decades ago to where we are now, we can count how many gases are trapped in the ice. So that's like a very tangible way of being able to understand how, we've been trapping a lot more greenhouse gases than we have in the past. So if someone else wants to like throw another reason why it's not happening, this is a really really tangible way of showing that we're just not making this up. Like there are people who go out and do this in real life. They exist. And we'll go on to the next slide. So this is further evidence. So another way that we're able to track this, there's this observatory called Mauna Loa. And this is in Hawaii. And basically this observatory is like away from people. It's like up really high. There's not that many things that would be interfering with the readings from this observatory. But for the longest time now, they've been tracking our carbon dioxide concentration or CO2 concentration in our atmosphere. And so it's set up in a really great location so that there isn't any like, way that someone can dispute that their readings are being thrown off by something. And you can see over time, like this goes back to 1960, and then it goes up to 2018, this particular graph. You can see over time that we've been adding, that our concentration of CO2 has grown quite substantially over time. In the 1960s, we were, slightly below 320 parts per million, so that word's coming up again. And then here at this time, which is a snapshot of April 29th, 2018, we were at 411 parts per million. So we've, we've added like almost 100 parts per million in that period of time. And then I know if you click forward again, there's like an even more updated information about this. Perfect. So you can see too that even within the last couple of years, we've already gone up to 416 parts per million. So every year we're like inching, not even inching, we keep adding and adding and adding. And all of that means bad news for us here on planet Earth, because that means that we're making the greenhouse gas effect worse, which is not great. And even more evidence. So now you know how we're collecting the information. We've mentioned that there's a greenhouse gas effect that's coming into play and that there's a relationship there between the gases and our temperature. So this is a graph that perfectly showcases that and that relationship. So you can see that the white line is a concentration of carbon dioxide, so one of the greenhouse gases that we've been talking about. And then you can see the blue line, which is tracking changes in our global temperature. So you can see that, when you put the two lines one over the other, that they're really closely tied together, that they're for the most part tracking the same way. So it's really hard to dispute that there's like a very, very positive relationship there where, if we're adding more CO2 gases, we can probably safely say that it's also getting hotter, that our temperatures are getting hotter. Theoretically, if we were to decrease the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, then we can probably deduce that it's going to get cooler and we'll have cooler global temperatures and not as drastic changes. So that's just another way of showing that these things are very much linked. And as I mentioned before, like those natural variations that I talked about, it's not enough to explain these like very big changes that you're seeing in these graphs that we're showing you. So this will really take you back to like middle school science probably. So this is the carbon cycle. This is part of the reason why we are alive. It's really important for us. So I like this graphic just because it shows the different ways that we're adding greenhouse gases to the atmosphere and ways that we are able to keep those greenhouse gases down as well. So you can see in the one side of the picture that we have like a little factory basically, and shows that it's burning fossil fuels and that is releasing carbon. You also have deforestation that's shown there with like trees being burnt. So that's part of the reason if you hear people talk about like the Amazon and the fact that we're cutting down trees or burning them, that's part of the reason why people are so worried about that, because then that releases CO2 into the atmosphere. Trees are really awesome. I'll talk about them later, but they're a really powerful but really also simple solution to all of this. Trees, they suck up that CO2 and then they give us oxygen. So they're just a really great tool of like, they're kind of like an air filter if you think about it in a way. So that's why it's really important to keep the trees that we do have and to continue planting more as we go along. And then, yeah, so that's mostly it. I think that's just like the biggest takeaways, that these are some of the ways that we're adding CO2, but also ways that we can make sure that we're minimizing the amount that we're letting out. Do you have a question? Or maybe he just unmuted. But yeah, like I said, I know I'm going through this a little quickly because I do want to get to kind of like more of the discussion part of things. But if you do have any questions, like I said, just feel free to chime in. So I now want to get more into like what are the other ways that we're adding greenhouse gases specifically, and really bringing it more to us and where we live here in South Florida. So I don't know if any of you guys have passed by this maybe, but this is what they're called, what Florida Power and Light is calling a clean energy center. You know, FPL's our utility down here, and this is Riviera Beach Next Generation Clean Energy Center. So when you think clean energy, what do you think this plant, like what kind of energy do you think they're giving off, or that we're getting?
Well, clean energy shouldn't be emitting any of the harmful gases into the air.
Mm-hmm. Definitely.
I agree.
So if you click, something will come up. So you said it shouldn't emit anything. Well, this center they're calling Clean Energy Center, it's actually it's methane, so that is a greenhouse gas, and it's actually more potent than CO2. So we do have a lot more CO2 out there in the atmosphere, and it's one of the ones that we're emitting the most. But on the flip side, methane, because of the way that it's set up as like a molecule and all of that, it can actually absorb heat a lot more efficiently than CO2. So in a way, it's kind of worse than carbon dioxide, but we often don't talk about it nearly as much as we do CO2, even though it's a lot more potent. So yes, so this is just a flag for you all. If you hear clean energy, it's good to always ask, what kind of energy are you using? Is it emitting something, as you mentioned? Because oftentimes it does get used as a way of pushing things forward, pushing plans forward. So I think it's important to be skeptical sometimes and to ask questions about what the proposals actually mean. And we'll talk about more about that too later on. So it's a bunch of livestock. Does anyone want to take a stab at how this might be contributing to climate change? What about this picture, about this setup might contribute?
The methane gas?
Mm-hmm. Do you want to provide more information about that? Like why or how?
Because cows poop. And so it is part of the offing of raising cows for meat and milk. So
Eliza in the chat says land and water utilization.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Especially if there were trees, like I mentioned before, trees are a really great way of sequestering carbon. So imagine if this was like a field that was full of trees and then we had to cut them down in order to create the space for the immense amount of like meat and dairy that we consume, then that definitely contributes to the overall impacts. Perfect. So we'll keep moving forward. So that's just one of the ways that we're contributing to this meat consumption and dairy consumption is definitely, that's one of the reasons why you hear people say, for example, that they're going vegan or vegetarian to cut down on how much they're consuming. And that's also why you might hear people say, you know, that have a tough time making that change, might just do like meatless Monday. So that's something you might hear too. So that's something that you definitely can consider as like more of a personal choice and a way to help with this issue.
And the deforestation that happens, especially in the Amazon as it relates to cattle farming, losing that carbon storage capacity, releasing the carbon from the deforestation, and then putting cow farts in their place.
Mm-hmm, definitely. So this picture is specifically more, it is Miami based. I was trying to find one like Fort Lauderdale based, but I think we can all probably relate to this picture. But does anyone want to describe how like traffic or congestion might be impacting or might be contributing to climate change? I think if you click it, it'll prompt those questions too. So yeah, does anyone want to take a guess how this contributes?
Well, I mean, I think it's the same as the emissions, right? And if we're one person in a vehicle and that kind of thing, we're contributing instead of helping.
Mm-hmm. And how might that be, imagine that you're someone who's like biking. Let's imagine there's like a bike lane, which we don't have that many down here, unfortunately. It's part of the issue, but imagine there is a bike lane next to this and you have someone that's biking along all of these trucks and cars that are emitting these emissions. How do you think they might be impacted?
They'd be really warm from the heat of the vehicles.
And I think Dr. Nico maybe was going to say something.
Oh, I'm just trying to navigate this. My picture is upside down. I don't want to interrupt you guys. I'm not really at this point going to contribute anything. So I'll just unmute. I'll mute my sound. I'm sorry to interrupt.
You're fine, Nico.
No worries. But yeah, if we're talking about greenhouse gas emissions, imagine someone is next to this, and there's a segment about climate and health impacts, but you can imagine all that pollution. You're exercising really hard, you're biking, your lungs are working harder, and you're breathing that stuff in that's like really gross and not great for you. So that's definitely some ways that people might be impacted by their health. It could lead to, respiratory issues later down the line, and we'll talk about that more, like I said, later down. So this is an aerial shot. This is more of a Miami picture, but I think, anyone who lives in suburbs, this is probably a pretty generic picture. But this can contribute to climate change in many ways. You have really densely packed houses. It doesn't look like there's a lot of public transit, so that is a great way of diminishing how much emissions we have, is if people are able to take mass public transit. But with the way this is set up, like you really can't do that. There's some trees, but not that many. So it just looks like you probably have to drive and, have to rely on your car to get out and like maybe get to your job and stuff like that. So that's oftentimes why you also hear mass public transit, like, having like rail or having a better bus system as ways to also solve this issue. This is a specific picture for you all. So this is a picture of one of the recycling or waste management plants in Broward. So you can see it's like a giant mountain of waste and trash, and you can probably see that there's like things in here that you probably can't recycle. Sometimes people aren't sure about what can or can't be recycled. But this definitely contributes to the issue as well. I know someone on Facebook for this event like mentioned this issue specifically. And so I think it's really important, like we do talk about recycling a lot as a solution, but one of the things that a lot of people don't know is that it's become really difficult now to recycle. Oftentimes, actually the US was shipping our trash to like other countries like China to deal with them. And now they're no longer doing that. And like in Europe, it's something similar with like countries would ship off their waste to others to deal with it and burn it and then use it as fuel. But some countries are like, you know what, this is too much. I don't want to deal with this anymore. It's your problem. So there's different reasons why our recycling systems aren't as effective as it used to be, and it's just become harder. So I think it's really important for everyone to know like how much they're contributing to that issue. And And there's definitely ways to cut down like how much plastic you're using, so you can like reduce and reuse, like, you know, remember the 3 R's: reduce, reuse, recycle. I think now it's really important to shift towards more of like the reduce and reuse part of the 3 R's, because our recycling systems can't really handle it anymore. And a lot of people don't know that. I know during the pandemic here in Miami, we actually stopped collecting recycling. So that was not great. And some people didn't know that. So there's things like that that can happen that can overwhelm the system. So, you know, there's like a lot of like fun things you can do on Pinterest. If any of you guys are Pinteresters or TikTokers for the younger folks on here, there are a lot of cool ways that you can use like jars and stuff like that to diminish what's going into landfills.
And if you have, I have a basically like 50 slide presentation on the cohb.org/green website. That's all about what's happening with the recycling system now. We could talk about it for hours, I'm sure, but since we're talking about climate change today, if you would like to know more about how recycling is functioning in Hallandale and the rest of the world, please reach out to me and I'd be happy to have a lengthy discussion with you.
Perfect, good plug. So usually I just let people kind of like read through this on their own and kind of let that sink in. But so what this slide says is the Earth is 4.6 billion years old. Let's scale that to 46 years. We have been here for 4 hours. Our Industrial Revolution began 1 minute ago. And in that time, we have destroyed more than 50% of the world's forests. So I really, really like this slide because it puts into perspective just like how new we really are in terms of the grand scheme of like the formation of the world. Like humans were not that old if you think about it in comparison. And just it really puts into perspective with that short amount of time, you know, how much damage we've really done to our world. And especially a forest, you know, we mentioned how that's a really good way of keeping carbon dioxide out of our atmosphere. And so the fact that we've managed to destroy, you know, so many habitats and cut down so many trees or burn them down, we're really shooting ourselves in the foot basically by doing that. So I just think it's really important to kind of ground ourselves in the fact that, you know, we haven't been here for that long. We need to do a better job of taking care of our Earth. So for anyone that might have like more conservative family members, this is not a political talk in any way, but I think that, you know, we can all safely say that this has become like a really partisan issue where, you know, Democrats and Republicans don't necessarily see eye to eye on this. But something I always like to bring up is that, you know, our armies and those that are in charge of like our national security, they actually really see this as a huge issue. If you think about it solely from the fact that with climate change, you know, we're disrupting economies, we have, you know, places that are dealing with such major impacts that it can destabilize them and their governments. It can lead to really big global issues. You can have countries fighting for scarce resources. You know, we're really dependent on oil. If any of those countries are having any infighting or having wars, like all of that starts to get really complicated for us. So even from like just that perspective of like national security, it's a really big issue. There's not a slide in this because we didn't have time, but also another thing to note is that a lot of our major military bases are coastal. So if you think about like places where people go to for deployment and stuff like that, they're like in Virginia, there's places in Texas and the coast. So even just like our infrastructure is in areas that are very prone to climate change impacts. So just from that perspective, I think it's also really just important to note that because oftentimes people don't think about it from that perspective, but it can have a lot of huge implications for us. And one other thing to note too is that, and this really irks me, I'm sure it irks Alyssa too, we haven't talked about it, but oftentimes when you see people talk about climate change, I'm sure you might have seen like Bill Nye the Science Guy, you know, up against someone else that doesn't believe in climate change. And it paints this picture of like a 50-50, that like 50% of people believe in this and 50% don't. But when you look at how many like peer-reviewed articles there have been, how many researchers and scientists have done work in this and to prove that this is happening, the vast majority of them, like 99% of them, believe and know that this is happening based off the science that we've been talking about for the last like almost 40 minutes now. So it's really, I think, disingenuous when we have these like debates and you have like, you know, one versus another person, when really you should probably be like 99 people speaking about climate change and how it's happening, and then one person speaking out against it, because that's the reality, is that that's the case, that most people really believe this is happening because of the science, and because we, from what we've been talking about, we can show that this is a real natural, not a natural thing, that it's human caused. So we're the reasons why climate change is gotten to the point where it is now. So wanted to bring this down more to like where you all live. So we'll move forward. So these are just some projections that I think are important for everyone to be aware of. So I had mentioned the Southeast Florida Regional Climate Change Compact. So this is a really unique thing to our region. This compact is made up of like the 4 most southern counties in Florida. So that's Broward, Miami-Dade, Monroe, and Palm Beach. And so it's really cool because elected officials and those that work in government especially have come together and they work on projections for what we should expect for our region. So if you think about climate change and its impacts, it doesn't stop. Like once you go from Miami-Dade to Broward, it's not like things aren't the same. For the most part, we're dealing with the same issues. So it's really important to have these unified projections, because then we can like build things to a certain level, to a certain standard where they can withstand, you know, incoming changes that we're seeing and expect to see. So these are from 2015. There is a more updated slide that'll come up next, but I just wanted to show you kind of the differences that we're already seeing. So for 2030, we were expecting 6 to 10 inches of sea level rise. And then looking forward to 2060, that's 14 to 26 inches. So we like to put this figure of a guy to kind of show you, like, you know, height wise, like what would that look like. So for 2030, that's like a little less than like half a foot to basically a foot. And then 2060, that's slightly over a foot to basically slightly over 2 feet of sea level rise. Which, when you think about that, that's a lot. I'm 5 feet tall, so that means that I would be, as an elderly woman, having to wade in water that's probably, you know, up to my knees, which is not great, depending on where I would live at that point. And then we'll show you the next slide, and that shows you kind of how things have shifted now. So this is the most recent projections that have come out, and you can see that now it's looking out to like 2040 and 2070. So for 2040, it's 10 inches to 17 inches. So it's slightly higher than before, but also that's like 10 years now past the previous projections. And then for 2070, it's 21 inches, so almost close to 2 feet now, to basically, you know, almost, you know, past 3 feet of sea level rise. So once again, that's, when you put into perspective, like I said, I'm 5 feet tall. That's even worse for me, assuming I'm still alive then, where it's definitely water past my knees. Going to be very difficult to get around at that point. So that's just kind of show you like what we're looking at now. You know, 2040 is only, you know, 20 years away. I think time flies by really, really quickly. So that's not too far from now, where we're expected already to see, you know, potentially, but depending on how things go, we could see at least like a foot of sea level rise by then.
And it's worth noting that the City Commission for Hallandale Beach will be voting on adopting what you see on the screen here tomorrow night at a commission meeting. We are looking at the high part of this to build our infrastructure, to make sure that we don't have infrastructure failures because of sea level rise inundation. So just giving you a heads up, that's being voted on tomorrow.
Another great plug. So now we're getting into like the real nitty gritty of it. So this is a king tide event that happened in 2017, and this is where you all are. This is not Miami. Does anyone know what king tide event is, what that means? I know Alyssa does, but that would be cheating. Also, it's called nuisance flooding sometimes. Any of that ring a bell, or sunny day flooding?
Well, I really don't know anything about it, but I bought my condo here in 2017 when this was happening. And so I do know that it's something that happens on some sort of periodic scale. Comes around every couple of years, I think. I'm not sure what the driving force is, though.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'm sure that probably scared you a little bit as you were buying property, which is one of like the major impacts of this. That depending if like you live somewhere where this is happening, it impacts your property, or if you're looking to buy, you start to think about like where is the best place to live. So the king tide events, those tend to happen in the fall. And I'm not a king tide expert, but basically just know that this tends to happen in the fall, and it's every year. We've actually gotten pretty good at knowing when this is supposed to happen. But basically, you might know that like the moon has an impact on our water, and can impact like the waves that come on shore. So at that time in the fall that we're talking about, the moon is closest to us, and so it can push more water onto our shores. I do not really know how the moon does that. I'm not an expert in that, but that's something that a phenomenon that happens. And so this happens several times in the fall, and like I said, we've gotten really good at knowing when it's supposed to happen. But yeah, this is an instance where there was a king tide event in 2017 in Hallandale Beach, and you can see that like there's water next to the I don't know if it's like apartment building, but you can see that it's basically like parallel. Like you can barely tell where the water starts and ends, basically because the amount of water that has come over. And another thing to note is that, we've been talking about sea level rise too. So imagine a king tide event, plus we have sea level rise happening. And then we haven't even talked about hurricanes. So that would be kind of like the triple whammy. Imagine that we have the king tide events happen in the fall, like I mentioned. Hurricane season is from June 1st to November 30th. So king tide events, unfortunately, also happen during hurricane season. So imagine you have a tropical storm or a hurricane headed our way, and we're also meant to experience a king tide event during that time. That's where the impacts really, really start to multiply. And I think those are some of the things that like definitely keep me up at night. I imagine they keep up Alyssa at night as we think about potential impacts. That's like one of the worst case scenarios, is to have something like that. So that's how you kind of start to see like how these all are we call them threat multipliers, basically. This is more recent. Does anyone remember when this flash flooding event happened in last year? So that wasn't that long ago now. I know it does feel like that, but it was December 2019. Does anyone remember this particular flash flood event? Did you have any issues during that time getting around, or even saw flooding in your own property?
Or Alyssa didn't get any sleep that night. I know that. That was right before Christmas, and I was out of town, so I know it was quite the incident.
Mm-hmm.
Being new here, I did buy my condo in 2017, but finally just permanently relocated. But I've learned very quickly to stay home after it rains. I have a car that's low to the ground, and it's not ideal to leave my house after it's rained.
Mm-hmm. Which at the very least, that's just like inconvenient, but at the most that can, really impact your quality of life if you can't leave your house after a storm like this, or a flooding event like this. Faith, I also see that you've been muted.
Yeah, I was wondering, I think that was that on Lane Boulevard? I know we had major problems, but we also had some pumps that had failed during that time. But yes, that was a that was a terrible time, but I think we had some pump failures, but
This
yeah.
one here is, this is Atlantic Shores, and
Okay.
the pumps didn't necessarily fail. They just, the wells that they used to pump the water down were full. We had more rain than it was designed to be able to deal with. It did take a while for them to turn on because they were getting the grates to bring the water to the pumps. We're getting clogged by debris, litter, palm fronds, stuff like that. We've since then, when we have events like this, we have stormwater crews go out and they actively just rake the city all night long to make sure that nothing is blocking any of these drains and to make sure that the pumps can get the water that they need. But if we have more water happen in an event than the system's designed for, we have to spend a whole lot of money to upgrade that system to be able to deal with these future conditions, which is what I'm trying to work with our infrastructure crews to make sure that we're thinking about future conditions as flooding may happen more from king tide and an event like this. We want to make sure that the system can deal with it.
Wonderful. And you said there's wells underneath the ground that hold the water?
Yeah, so our pump stations that are on Northeast 14th, and that's the only place where they're up and working right now, stormwater pump stations. It's deep well injection where we are injecting the stormwater by force into basically a well that we've dug that goes past our drinking water aquifer. But if the ground is saturated from the rain and there might be a high tide that then brings the water up more, there's only so much space that we can push the water to before it can't go anywhere, unfortunately.
Okay.
We'll
So
talk
the
about solutions too.
Yeah. Okay, good.
I know now you're like, oh my God, I'm worried about everything.
Don't worry,
Yeah,
Faith, I'm here actively. I'm actively working on this every day, and our public works crews are aware of the conditions to come, as well as the conditions that we've experienced already. And they don't like it when stuff doesn't work either. It makes life a hassle for them as well. So we want to make sure that everything's functioning as best as we can for current and future conditions. And we're having those conversations. We're putting money into design. We're doing installation of additional pump stations. We're doing what we can. It's probably not as much as we can because we're limited by funding, but we're applying for as many grants as we can to get supplemental funds to be able to adapt to these conditions.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, I should have prefaced this by saying that usually like when we talk about like the climate change impacts, it's very often that people either get really bummed out and depressed or like really worry. Like I whenever I do these talks, I see people's faces and they're like, oh my God, like this is such a big issue. But there is time at the end where we'll be discussing what we can all do it in a personal level, but also like on a community-wide, even like policy-wide level to make sure that we're adapting, but also that we're mitigating, you know, these impacts. So we'll talk about that more later on. So you'll leave on a positive note. That's my hope, that you'll be aware and educated about this, but also feel like you can do something about it.
And Faith and everyone else on the call, I am here for you. If a resident wants to talk about the issues and get more in-depth information or express their concerns, or if they want to complain about something, I clear my day. I make time for you. I serve you. If I need to describe it several different ways before it clicks, I'm here for that. So always feel free to reach out.
It's a good idea for the residents, you're right, because I hear it a lot from other people that live in some of these areas, and they don't understand the real reason why it's happening. It's good to see how the climate, you know, how the environment is affecting it and what we can do with the infrastructure so they have the real reason, and they know there's a solution on the way. So I will reach out to you. Thank you.
Yay, that's the goal. We're already meeting our goals. I'm happy about that. So I don't know if you all recognize the woman on the left, or I guess, yeah.
Michelle Lazaro.
Yes. So she's a commissioner for you all. So this is not that long ago. That was only, well, I guess it was like, what, 3 months ago now in COVID time. It feels like a very different time frame. But I think we all felt this one. I know I live in Brickell in Miami, and we, you know, we were like in a little island. Our street was okay, and then anything outside of that was completely flooded, a crazy amount. So we couldn't leave our little radius. We could only walk our dog like a very short distance. And similarly, up where you all are, you know, you can see that she's in knee deep water. Also, that water, just to point out, does not look clean. Does not look like something you'd want to be wading through. Something I always like to point out is like, imagine that we have an event like this. We talked about like the issues with like waste and recycling. I know where I live, people never pick up after dogs, which is also a huge problem. If you have like feces like flying about in the water, there might be fertilizer runoff, all sorts of things in the water that you have to now wade through. And I think like if you have a child, but also even just like as an adult, like no one wants to go through that. And there's just a lot of public health impacts to that. But yeah, that's 2 flash flooding events that have now taken place in your area in basically 6 months, which is kind of crazy. That's once you start to look at it from that sense and start to clock how often these things are happening, you start to see it's just not just like a coincidence. Like there's a reason why this is happening, and it is very much tied to the climate change impacts that we're talking about.
And it's so the previous picture that was on Atlantic shores, there are a couple storm drains in that part of the city, mostly at Northeast 14th, that people use the storm drains as a trash can, specifically for bags of dog poop. And I just want to note that that doesn't make the water very clean at all. And stormwater drains are not trash cans, and that putting plastic filled with dog poop into the stormwater drain then clogs the stormwater drain. That makes it so that we can't pump the water and get the water out of there. So there's different ways that we need to make sure that we're managing our own waste, making sure other people aren't littering, because that is littering that can then exacerbate these issues that are already extreme to begin with.
Absolutely. It's like having a well, yeah, like you're already starting off like, you know, you already have like a lot of obstacles in your way, and then yeah, it's just making it worse basically. So we're almost wrapping up with this section. But this is a sea level rise map for City of Hallandale Beach. And you can see, so this is projecting out to 2070, and this is very much tied to the projections that we were talking about earlier. So you can see there's kind of like a periwinkle color, actually kind of like similar to what I'm wearing, that is projecting 5 feet of sea level rise, which that's as tall as me, which is not great. I wouldn't want to be living there because I would just, you know, be underwater. You have a darker like aquamarine blue color that's 4 feet, which is a lot of the eastern side of the city. And then you have like the darker blue color, which it's harder to see, but it's there. Thank you, Alyssa, for highlighting that. And that's projecting 2 feet of sea level rise. So that's 2070. So that's 50 years away. So you can see that there's a lot of work that needs to be done in order to make sure that, you know, the city is still able to survive basically by not even the end of the century. So it's great that you have people like Alyssa that are working on these issues now and like really keeping an eye towards what we're expecting to see. Because you can imagine if, you know, you're just building for what you expect for like the next decade, you're not going to be building to the standards that you need to be able to withstand these changes by, you know, 2070, when we're expecting to see really big impacts.
And I know that this map is probably scary for many of you, especially if you live on the eastern side of the city. This doesn't necessarily mean that it will be constantly inundated at 5 feet, but at high tide, definitely. We're doing what we can. Obviously, private property, you should carry flood insurance in this area and work to make adaptations to your home. Flood proof, raise if you can. This is what's to come. And I see someone in the chat. Yep. Okay. Yeah. So if you have questions about clarifying this map, I'm here, or we can continue to move on. Up to you.
And like I said, we'll talk about the bigger solutions at the end. So I think that's it for this section. So we've been talking for like an hour now, so I definitely want to give you all a break. I know it's dinner time, so if you want to go grab something or whatever it is, we can all meet back at, so we'll give everyone 5 minutes, so 6:12. I know it's a little exact, but just to keep it going because we still have a decent bit of stuff to go through.
And what's to come is very interesting. So make sure that you don't leave and not come back. Come back.
Yes.
Can I ask a question, Alyssa?
Yes.
Can you hear me? I don't know if you can hear me.
I can hear you, Nico.
Oh, yeah, I just wanted to, I don't want to interrupt the break, but while you're sitting there and this guest speaker, I just want to ask about the storm drains. Those things they're kind of large. They're always situated right in front of the drains in the street. And are they filtering out sediment or litter, or what are those things? They seem to me to be blocking everything.
So it's kind of a double-edged sword. We're not currently like straining stuff before it goes in or goes out, because we don't want stuff to get stuck on that straining thing, essentially. So think about it, if you're putting like cheesecloth over it, and as soon as a couple leaves get there, it's going to block it a lot sooner than if it was filling the basin, moving out. And I know what you're getting at with plastics, I know. We are putting some kind of not blockers. We're putting some filters on some, and we're piloting it to see if it can make it so that we can filter out some of these contaminants, mostly litter, and still have a functioning stormwater system. So we are experimenting. Other cities, mostly in other countries, have like these kind of hairnet type things at the end where they collect things. And that can keep the bigger particulate matter from going in, because our stormwater outfalls do go into the intercoastal, into our lakes. We have, except for in the case of the pump station that puts it down into the groundwater, we are not required to filter it, but we are starting to experiment with that, and hopefully it will be fully functional. And then if it shows to be fully functional, we will be putting that on as many stormwater grades as we can, so that we can reduce the amount of pollution. But we're testing it out first, because the last thing we would want is for another flash flood like that to happen and everything gets blocked up. But
well, I'm sure we're in good hands with your professional, monitoring and oversight, Alyssa, and I really mean that. But I don't want to interrupt your break here. I'd like to let you guys still get the break.
Nico, if you want to talk during the break, we can. It's fine. Okay. And we did pass the Coral Reef Protection Ordinance, so we do have a fertilizer blackout for the wet months. So at least that's not going out, or it shouldn't be going out with the stormwater, because it's not only just the plastics, but it's also a number of different nutrient issues. Fertilizer runoff, the runoff from, like, if someone has an oil spill or oil leak in their car and the water washes that away, pesticides, all sorts of gross stuff goes into the water, unfortunately. And we're trying to do what we can without harming the functionality of the system to reduce those inputs, because we and I care about the water quality, the habitat for the animals that live there, and boosting that habitat to actually embrace more life in our waterways.
Yeah, you surely have your work cut out for you. I just want to back up a little bit with is this Faith Burr that I see here? Is that you, the speaker?
No, that's Myra. Myra is the speaker.
Excuse me, because I thought okay. All right, Myra, I was just want to back up a little bit. You mentioned about the trees and how wonderful it is that they absorb all the carbon dioxide and, emit oxygen, which is something that I always realized. And living here in Hallandale, we had in South Beach, we had that, I don't know, I'm sure, Alyssa, you recall this, we had wonderful palm trees, pine trees in South Beach. Do you recall that, Alyssa? The South Beach Park?
Pine trees?
Yeah, the whole
we used to have Australian pines, from what I recall. Our entire barrier island used to be mangrove. I saw a 100-year-old map of Hallandale Beach, and it broke my heart. But we used to have Australian pines. They're not native species.
And what I can't understand is how the city justified at the time to just decimate all of that entire South Beach Park of these illustrious. These were mammoth. These were large, beautiful pine trees that were and they provided shade and cooling, oxygen, air. Now, Myra, what do you think would be the justification for decimating it for a larger parking lot? I'm not criticizing because it's actually it wouldn't matter.
Yeah, you're just asking.
What is?
I mean, I think, yeah, I'm happy to take a guess. Because I mean, I think we all go through this. I think any of us that live in major cities, we've seen that happen before, where areas get torn down or cut down in order to allow for development. I think it's a matter of what we value and how, like, what we prioritize, basically. What are the things that we really care about? So I think oftentimes, with development, it does allow for, more real estate money to come in. It allows for businesses to be there, so it brings in more money. So oftentimes that gets priority over keeping, a park or keeping an area that has trees in place, anything like that. I think it's a matter of looking at things like short-term versus long-term. If you're thinking about it long-term, you might reconsider doing something like that and recognizing that it's really important to keep these natural infrastructures in place because it helps us out in the long run. Whereas if you put up, another condo building, it has less value to us if we think about it just from the climate change perspective. So I think that's where it comes down to. It's a matter of like money. What allows us to make a revenue right now. We're not thinking about those longer term impacts.
I got you.
So this is Kathy. So
I wanted you to weigh in. You wanted you to weigh in on this. That was just about.
I just have to say the trees that were at South City Beach were invasive. They were Australian pines. They're not native or healthy for this area. If you remember going to that park, Nico, there was no. The ground cover was pine needles that you didn't have grass. There was no sun that got down, to the ground level. The whole thing was Australian pines. We had the same thing at Golden Isles Park, was very heavy in Australian pines too. Probably those two more than anywhere else. So just like the Scavola projects we're doing on the dune, those plants are invasive. They're not healthy. They're not native to our environment. And so that's why they're removed. So you may not know, but we have a lot of sea oaks there. We have a lot of the dunes. Alyssa's been doing a great job with the replanting our dunes with all native. And we have one more or two more, Alyssa, to get rid of the last of the Scavola.
Two more. So this upcoming one, who knows about it?
Get rid of the last of it. Yes. So we're definitely, in this case, it wasn't because of development that we took out those trees. We did it while we were developing the park, but it was because they were invasive. They're not native or healthy for the environment there.
And those pine trees, they actually, they're allelopathic, so they actually emit a number of different chemical compounds from their roots and from the droppings that they drop that don't allow any other plants to live there. So they wouldn't have promoted like a polyculture kind of habitat. They were invasive. They did provide shade and they did sequester carbon, but we're working to do that with native plants. And I know that it's 6:16, so I'm sure Myra wants to get back to this. But Nico, I'm happy to talk with you about trees in Beach Park.
Thank you, Kathy, for explaining that. I appreciate it. As always.
Thank you, everyone. So hopefully everyone's made it back. And yes, thank you, Alyssa, for the time check. So we're now going to shift a little bit and thinking more broadly about where that intersection is of climate change and how it impacts our health. So we've already talked about that a little bit, but we want to get deeper into it so you all have a better understanding of what this means for you and your communities. So this was taking like a broader, aerial shot of health here, but this is life expectancy for countries around the world, and you have to look all the way down in the chart to see where the U.S. lies. So this is from 2015, so it's a little dated, but we're still not doing great in comparison to other countries. But you can see that we're 43rd in ranking when it comes to life expectancy. So that means like how long people are expected to live, basically. So you can see that we're a little less than like expected to live until like 80, whereas other countries are way above that. And you can see some countries, like if you look up a little bit, like, you know, like there's some European countries, there's Bermuda, Cayman Islands, like some places that you would necessarily think of as having as many resources as the US. So I just want to flag that to kind of ground us in that. So why is that the case? So one reason the US ranks so poorly is because the health outcomes for certain racial, ethnic, and socioeconomic groups, they fare really poorly in comparison to others, especially when we think about communities of color like African Americans and Latinos. They're economically disadvantaged, and so that poses a lot of obstacles when it comes to having access to healthcare. Usually it's a lot harder to come by if you're economically disadvantaged and you're also a person of color. And oftentimes, if you can access that healthcare, it's lower quality than what a white American would be able to have access to. So it ends up creating this gap between those that are more affluent or might be white versus those that are lower income or lower wealth, and also are people of color. So I'll get into why that's the case. So just really quickly, you might be wondering, what are health disparities? What are we talking about here? So health disparities really gets to the fact that there's preventable things that we can do when it comes to the burden of disease, injury, violence, anything like that, to achieve optimal health that are experienced by socially disadvantaged populations. And when we're talking about these populations that are socially disadvantaged, we're really thinking about those that might fall under different buckets, or are impacted by different factors. So that might be race or ethnicity, gender, your education or income, your disability or ability, geographic location, so like if you live somewhere more rural with less access, or someone more urban, or your sexual orientation. And I just like to point out that oftentimes those things that are listed here, like your gender, your disability or ability, oftentimes those are things that are outside of your control that you can't really change. That's how you're born. That's your identity. And so these health disparities are inequitable, and they're very much tied to the historical and the unequal distributions that we have when it comes to social, political, economic, and environmental resources. So one way that this really comes to light is within our healthcare systems here. I don't know if any of you guys have ever heard someone talk about this in their experience, if they're identified as Black or African American, but there have been times where, this was really a public example where, for example, Serena Williams, she's really famous. She's an awesome superstar tennis star. She happens to be a Black woman. When she was giving birth to her daughter, she has a tendency to create blood clots, and she had a complication with her delivery, and so she let her doctors know, and she told them, like, I have a history of this. I have a feeling that I might have a blood clot, like I'm in pain. There's something really wrong here. And they almost lost her. And for whatever reason, the doctors didn't listen to her, even though that she had a very much known history of having these issues. So there's this perception sometimes that doctors have where they might offer less relief to Black patients, and especially female patients. So there's this disparity that exists within our healthcare system where, because of pre-existing beliefs or some bias that you might have, you have these disparities coming up with the way that people of color, especially Black and African American people, with the kind of care that they're receiving. And I'm sure you're probably wondering how this all connects, but I promise it'll come together with the climate change impacts. So the reason I point that out is because, as you all might know, our country is becoming more diverse as the years go by. So this is from 1990, so you can see that those places that are darker in color have more than 50% people of color. And then if you go to the next slide, you can see that by 2040, so in 20 years, we're expected to have really a lot of like the southern part of our country be expected to be more than 50% people of color. So when we talk about the fact that these disparities are in place, and then we're expected to have more people of color in the US, that sets us up for a lot of issues if we don't start to address those disparities that are in place now. And the reason this matters is because oftentimes those that are feeling the impacts of climate change are people of color, are people that are lower income, that have less economic means to adapt to these changes. So we'll get more into that as we go along. So which systems does climate change affect? So you can see going from the left to the right. So that's like your bones. Then I think the next one would be your nervous system, your cardiovascular, like your blood system, your lungs, your GI system, your gastrointestinal system, and then your muscles. So climate change can impact all of those things. We won't go into every single one, but we'll probably touch almost all of those as we go along in the presentation. So we've been talking about like sea level rise, for example, and flooding, but there are impacts to our own health that happen because of climate change. So one of the things that we're expected to see is that climate change is expected to worsen asthma and other respiratory diseases. And that's because we're having more exposure to mold, for example. So we've been talking about flooding. Let's say that that happens to your home. Oftentimes, if you're not able to treat it in time, or if it's too much, then you have mold that comes up, and then that can lead to a lot of respiratory problems. And we'll talk about pollen air pollutants as well. So it will definitely worsen allergens and allergies. So because of the way that CO2 works with like our plants, for example, it can actually make the pollen more potent, which is kind of crazy and mind-boggling when you start to look into how this impacts our plants, especially like poison ivy, for example. It's expected to be even like more poisonous. And so when we talk about pollen specifically, though, if you think about the way our seasons are set up, we don't really have seasons, right? But basically, we're expected, because of the warming temperatures, to extend how long our allergy seasons last. And you can even see, just looking at the data, when you compare 2005 to 2012, that the the number of times that people have gone to the hospital to see a doctor for their allergies, that it's basically doubled in that period of time, which is not that long. That's only 7 years. So that's something that we're expected to see get worsened over time, especially down here. We already have basically a pretty long allergy season, but we're expecting to see that be longer. And I know I've had conversations with doctors who have noticed that they have patients that they see, and like now they have to ask for more medication. They have to spend more out of pocket to get the meds that they need. And so when we were talking about those health disparities and the fact that people who are lower income feel the impacts worse, this is one of those ways. Imagine someone that's already on a tight budget, and then because of climate change impacts, things are getting worse, their allergies get worse. Now they have to spend more money on seeing the doctor. Maybe they have asthma related allergies. And so they have to get more medicine, more treatment. So all of that starts to add up, and that's just like one aspect of it. Imagine if this person also lives in a home that tends to flood, and they have to take care of that. So that's another way that, we talked about a threat multiplier. That's one way that like one person can have serious climate change impacts all at once. So heat is probably one that feels more familiar to all of us. I know that this summer has already felt really hot to me, at least. And if you go on to the next slide, so there's different populations that tend to feel this. I mean, we all feel the impacts of extreme heat, but I like to point out that there are certain groups that tend to be more vulnerable than others. So definitely, if you have a younger kid, someone that might be out exercising in like really hot and humid weather, they could be at risk of having some heat-related illness, for example. I know I did a presentation actually in Broward with some schools there, and I asked this question, how many students had experienced like either dizziness or like fatigue, or maybe even threw up, or had like even more adverse reaction to extreme heat. And I was really shocked and saddened to see that a lot, like probably like more than half of the students, and I did this presentation 4 times, I think, raised their hands saying that. And then I was looking at the adults in the room because they're with their teachers, and I was like, please make a note of this. This is a huge, huge problem that we're putting our youth at risk. And you can imagine if you have someone that has like respiratory issues or heart-related issues, or you have a kid that has all these issues, that's even more compounding effects on someone. So that's like part of the reason actually why elderly people especially are very susceptible to extreme heat because of age, and like the way your body works, it doesn't work as effectively as it used to be able to, balance the heat that you're feeling. So if your body has to work extra hard, that's when the issues come up, and you might have people experience a heat stroke, for example. And that's really the same for, outdoor workers. People forget that we do have a lot of agriculture in Florida. So we actually do have a lot of people that are working outside, that are working really hard to provide the produce that we need. And, a lot of people don't know that there aren't protections in place for those that work outside, which is a huge issue. We unfortunately don't have any mandate or regulations that say that if you work outdoors and in agriculture that you, and Alyssa said in city workers as well that work in the field, there's nothing that says that they need like water breaks or that they need to have cooling centers nearby or some sort of protection or access to water or whatever it is to stay safe when we do have extreme heat happening. So that's a huge issue. And the same for, those that might work in construction or even like UPS drivers or FedEx drivers. I learned that they don't have AC usually in their trucks. And so you imagine you're like, all those Amazon boxes that we're ordering, especially now, they have to unload and like, carry that to your front doorstep and all of that. Like that's very tedious and exhausting work. So I always like to point this out because I think all of us do feel the extreme heat, but there's this like notion that, oh, we're from Florida, you can handle the heat, but it's really, really terrible, especially if you're in any of these vulnerable populations and groups. And that's not even considering those that maybe can't afford to have their AC on. I know community members that we work with that have really high bills and unfortunately are choosing to not turn on their AC right now because they just can't afford to run it. So it's things like that, and that's why I really like to talk about the health impacts, is I think it's one thing to talk about a building that's flooding, but it's different to talk about someone's experiences and having to deal with this at a very personal level. It does humanize it a lot, and it makes people listen more usually. So another thing that I'm sure we all dislike is mosquitoes. So I know there's been the Zika scare that's happened before. If we go to the next slide, I think there's a couple on this. So yeah, there's like Zika, there's West Nile virus, there's dengue. Florida, we're pretty far south, pretty close to the equator when you think about it. So we do have, unfortunately, the perfect climate for that, but because of the heat and like the humidity they have going on and the fact that that's expected to get even worse, become an even better breeding ground for these mosquitoes that carry these dangerous diseases. And unfortunately, on top of coronavirus, we already do have some cases of dengue in the Keys. There has been some cases of that, and maybe you've heard of like others. Like I think we've also had West Nile virus. So it's definitely an issue, and that's why like standing water and all of those like flooding protections that Alyssa was talking about are super important, because that's what mosquitoes like. That's why they like the water. They like to breed in that. So it's like super important to be able to have protections in place so we don't invite more mosquitoes to come here and to cause issues for us health-wise. And so, yeah, this is the same for Zika. I think we all remember that, and how, you know, scary it was, especially for people that were pregnant at the time. And it's something that can still pop up. It hasn't gone away. It's something that we can definitely expect to have issues around in the future. So there's a really awesome but not awesome picture of this next. We wanted to point out the issues of algae blooms or algal blooms. Does anyone remember when this was a really hot topic? Probably like last year or 2 years ago, where you even had like Governor DeSantis talking about this and, you know, wanting to put a task force to work on this. Does anyone remember that?
Like the Lake Okeechobee?
Mm-hmm.
Yep, I do.
Mm-hmm. And I don't know if any of you were out and about. I don't know if like you like smelled the water or saw it, but it was probably really disturbing.
My godson lives right near where this picture was taken in St. Lucie.
Yes. And so a lot of people don't realize that this can be toxic to people. So there's a number of issues with it. First of all, it just looks disgusting. Does not look inviting. It has a lot of impacts to industries, for example. You know, we definitely rely on tourism here. So to have something like this happen is really not great. But on a deeper level, you know, when the algae blooms happen, you know, the wildlife under the water, they need, the sea life, they need oxygen to survive and thrive and all of that. But when you have these algae blooms happen, that basically cuts off that oxygen supply that they need to thrive. So it makes the issue even worse. And a lot of people don't realize that a lot of the main reasons why this happened is that it's because of us. It's another human caused issue where because of fertilizer and pollution, if you think about the Lake Okeechobee and the industries that are there, like the sugar industry is huge in that area. There's a lot of fertilizer that goes into that production. So all of that runs off. And that fertilizer, you know, there's reactions that take place in the water that I won't get into, but basically it leads to algae being super happy and they start to, you know, become more and more and more and they multiply. And some of that is okay. Algae is fine. It provides food and even like wildlife for some species. But like I said, too much of anything is never usually good. And this is one of those cases where it starts to multiply and then it's like fish die and all of that and like plant life dies. Basically, you just get this really terrible soupy mess that can also be impactful to people's health and cause issues that lead to issues with your neurological system. People describe having headaches, for example, and not feeling great when they were out near the situation. I don't think we've had any as of late, but it's something that tends to get worse over the summer too. So that's something to point out, that because of warmer temperatures, this also can become a worse issue in the future.
There's a large bloom in Lake Okeechobee now, and it has been for a number of months, but they haven't had to discharge water out of Lake Okeechobee yet. So thankfully these haven't been put into our estuaries, but they are impacting people that live next to Lake Okeechobee, including farm worker communities like Belk Lake.
Mm-hmm. So there's another lovely picture. Does this look familiar to anyone? The like really gross, like brown looking stuff that
Not quite that bad.
It's not that gross.
Ours isn't quite that bad.
Yeah. I mean, this is like a picture from South Florida. I couldn't find the exact location, but it might have been like Miami, like somewhere closer to Miami. But I don't know. It's funny, when I moved to Miami a couple of years ago, I went to the beach and I was expecting this like beautiful blue water, and then I saw something like this and I was like, what the heck? What happened? It smelled really gross and like rotten eggs. And I was just, you know, when you see the pictures of South Florida, you see the beautiful like blue water. So I was just really thrown off as a non-Miami native to see this happen. So it's something similar where it's a similar phenomenon to what we're describing with the algae blooms. This in particular, you know, it is also helpful to have some of it. It provides habitat and, you know, food for our sea life. But like I said, if it gets out of control, it can look like this picture where it's really a nuisance, but also the smell is quite disgusting and gross. And then when you have too much of it, it starts to, once again, like cut off that oxygen supply, and then it leads to a lot of environmental impacts for our wildlife. But yeah, I think it's just important to note, like, you know, we just have a lot of impacts on our environment if we're not mindful about them. So I think it's just good to ground ourselves in that. And unfortunately, when we impact the environment, because we live in the environment, it impacts us back. So it's good to, it's a helpful reminder I'd like to bring people's attention to. And one that's a big one that sometimes is a bit taboo or we don't talk about a lot is the really like the stress and the impact that comes from climate change impacts and having to deal with these issues. There's you know, with like more intense storms that we're seeing and expecting to see, you know, sometimes people have to move, maybe their homes are destroyed, or maybe they're just past salvaging, or they can't afford to stay there, so they have to leave. They have to leave their communities behind, or maybe they lose their jobs, which then, you know, can lead to stress. You might be depressed. You might have post-traumatic stress disorder, especially, you know, I know we can all probably remember like Katrina, or even Andrew, if you were here. You can imagine the amount of mental health impacts that someone must go through if they're met with such a big disaster that also feels so out of your control. Like, you didn't cause this, is something that happened to you. And if you go on to the next slide. So just going a little deeper into it too, we've also noticed that as like it gets hotter, that it can lead to more aggression, violence, and depression. And that stress that results from major disasters such as hurricane can have potentially long-term effects. So there's a lot there that like we still have to unpack, but I think, you know, if we think about an example I like to use, like let's say we do have a farm worker, someone that doesn't have any protections in place, they have to work outside, they're not making a lot of money. And then let's say that we do have a storm that comes by, it ruins the crops for this farm worker, they're left without a job. And they've already been dealing with the continuous stress of their job and not having protections in place. And now they can't put food on the table, they can't provide for their family. That's a lot of mental health strain for someone to go through. So these are the kinds of things that we're seeing a lot of now. And, you know, I know, and this is like more minor, but I know like I'm originally from Houston, and I've had to evacuate before for storms, and that happened when I was younger, and I still never forgotten that, will never forget that. And I, you know, especially when it's like hurricane season here, I'm always like bracing myself, like, God, I really hope nothing bad happens. And so that's something really minor, but like it's something I haven't forgotten about. I've always remembered our family packing up and having to leave, and what that meant for us. I remember crying and being really stressed and thinking that we're going to come back to something that, you know, I didn't know what that would look like. So that's just like an example, like a personal example I like to use, but I think you can all probably relate to that, or if you start to think about it, you might realize that there are ways that this has been weighing on you.
And I put in the chat that I know other cities in the United States have, the people in my position have formed basically support groups for how sad and the level of grief that we may feel about climate change and the impacts, not only for ourselves and our own personal situations, but just for the whole world. There's a whole body of new psychological research looking at the way that people are dealing with the situation, because it is complex, it's sad, it's stressful. If that's something that our residents need to be able to deal with the stress and to be able to talk about it, I'm happy to put together a climate grief support group however I can. Just putting that out there that if you're feeling stress or depression about this, we can get together and work through it ourselves, or get help, of course, but we can have a community solution too.
I love that suggestion. And that was a really good way of wrapping that up. I think just to really summarize that, I think talking about the public health impacts is just really important to really, like I said, humanize the issue, put a face to it. But also it's real life impacts that I think a lot of us are already going through. You know, it's easier to think about climate change sometimes in the ways that it's impacting you personally. Sometimes it just goes beyond just like infrastructure issues. It's about all the things that we just discussed. And I think the reason we really start this presentation with talking about health disparities is that, you know, if you're someone that has, you know, higher economic means, for example, for some of this, like, you know, it still would completely be terrible to have your home destroyed. But if you have the money to move somewhere else or rebuild your home, you know, you can recover more quickly. You might be less stressed about that. There might be less strain on you. But for someone that has less means, that's a whole different set of issues that they now have to go through. And so that's why I think it's just important to like ground yourself in that and like recognize that there might be people that are experiencing this a lot worse than we might be, depending on whether they are a person of color or if they have you know, just lower means. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in the next session, what that all comes down to and boils down to. But
We're dwindling off a little bit. A number of people are dropping off, so I wanted to take a pulse of the group if you wanted to take a break or if you want to keep pushing through, if that's okay.
I'm good to keep going.
Hearing no objections?
Me too.
Okay. We'll keep
going.
All right.
If
Is it
everybody's
all right? That work for you, Myra?
I know it's a long time. Yeah, no, it's totally fine.
Okay.
So this is kind of our last segment, and then we'll have time for discussion, and then, like I said, wrap up with the positive parts and what we can all do. But I think it's really important to talk about environmental and climate justice. So what I was talking about before, like those disparities and where like certain groups experience these impacts a lot worse than others, that boils down to basically environmental and climate justice. So environmental justice can be defined a number of ways. I really like this particular like beautiful snapshot. It says environmental justice is our cry of defiance against the onslaught of oppressive toxins and toxic oppressions that threaten to submerge our homes. So basically, environmental justice, what it comes down to is that oftentimes the burden of like the environmental you know, impacts that we're seeing and like the things that we're doing to our environment, they're often, the burden is usually on communities of color, indigenous communities, those that are lower income. And so if you go on to the next slide, we'll just skip over that for now.
Spoiler alert, it's white dudes.
Yeah. So this is a really powerful example of that. Just for the sake of time, I have to skip over that, but yes, that is true. But this is really like the birth of the environmental justice movement. I think this is a perfect way of kind of capturing what it means and what yeah, what just happens when we talk about this. So this is a really powerful picture. This is in Warren County, North Carolina. I don't know if anyone's from there, but during the 80s, there was this huge problem that came about where you had this community in Warren County that was poor, rural, overwhelmingly Black. And the state government there decided that this was the place for them to get rid of some toxic material. So it's PCBs, don't have to get into it, but basically it's just not a great chemical to have like in your backyard or anywhere near you. So thankfully we've already talked about climate and health impacts, so just know that this is something that would have impacted people's health. And so this became a really big issue because there wasn't a process for community members to speak up about this. There wasn't a really great way for them to say, hey, like we don't want this in our backyard. Why are you putting this in our backyard, but not in like in a more affluent part of the city and the county? And so because of that, you have this picture that happened where you had people literally laying down on the ground to stop the trucks from bringing in the toxic material and waste to go into the landfill. So you can see like even like young kids on off to his side that are there protesting this, and then you can see the police. And I'll just point out, because we've been talking about the Black Lives Matter movement a lot recently. This probably looks somewhat familiar to what we've been seeing now. Unfortunately, history tends to repeat itself, and this is definitely one of those cases. And so this was in 1982, this particular picture, where they were going in to drop this off. And like I said, people laid down to try to protest this. And it was several weeks of trying to fight this. And eventually the people there ultimately lost the battle. And so the toxic waste still ended up in a landfill there. But we like to point this story out because it's happened many, many, many times over. I don't have a slide of this in the presentation, but for example, here in our own backyard in Miami, I'm sure y'all know about I-95, but we have a community called Overtown, which is another historically Black neighborhood here that was really thriving in like the 50s. It was a middle wealth community where a lot of small businesses were around, and it was a way of having upward mobility. There was definitely a chance of that in the community. But the local government decided that it was time to expand the highway. And originally this was supposed to go up in Coral Gables, which is a more affluent part of the city. It is was definitely more white at the time, it still kind of is now. They fought that, and they had the political power and the know-how to fight that. So they looked over and they're like, well, Overtown, they probably don't have that political will to fight this, and purposely put the highway through there. And so I don't know if any of you guys ever come down here, but if you drive through the neighborhood, it still looks pretty decimated. It hasn't completely recovered from a literal highway being put down in the middle of the city. So a lot of small businesses had to move up. Actually, some of them ended up in Broward or elsewhere, just didn't ever open up again. And we talked about air pollution impacting our lungs. We have proof that those that live in Overtown have higher rates of asthma and have respiratory problems. I don't have a picture of this, but actually one of the pillars of the highway actually is in the corner of the high school there. So you have kids that are running track, that are doing their sports, and the highway is literally looming overhead of them. So that's just like a backyard example. I'm sure if you think about it, we're gonna have discussion about this, but I'm curious to know, just giving you now the context, if you've seen this now, or now that you think about it in this light, if there's cases of this in your own backyards.
Well, I can, so in Hallandale is really 4 quadrants. We're literally separated by train tracks from the east to west, and by Hallandale Beach Boulevard from the north to south. And so our northwest quadrant is the lowest income of the community. It's predominantly African American, historically African American. And that's where the industrial area, we only have one real industrial area in our city, and it's in the northwest. The public works plant is in the northwest, the water treatment, sanitation, that kind of thing is in the northwest. So historically, people who grew up there, because we hear from them all the time, weren't allowed as kids, and as adults didn't feel safe going across the tracks. And when the pool was desegregated, which was east of the tracks, most of them still weren't allowed to go to the pool, because it was on the other side of the tracks. So I think we see that still, because you don't see we haven't seen an industrial area pop up anywhere else in the city, or that one really be deconstructed, moved, anything like that. It's evident that that's what happened here in the Northwest, for sure.
There's also more contaminated sites in the Northwest. It's both the Southwest and the Northwest quadrant are up against 95, getting those air quality impacts from the interstate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you can go on to the next slide. So this is a really great kind of summary of all of that. So the environmental justice movement addresses a statistical fact, and they say statistical because it's not just like random or like, it's not like people got a map and like threw a dart and we're like, oh, it just landed here, that's where we're gonna put this thing up. Like it's on purpose. But it's people who live, work, and play in America's most polluted environments are commonly people of color and the poor. Environmental justice advocates have shown that this is no accident. Communities of color, which are often poor, are routinely targeted to host facilities that have negative environmental impacts, say a landfill, dirty industrial plant, or truck depot. The statistics provide clear evidence of what the movement rightly calls environmental racism. So I'm glad that you brought that up, Kathy, because it fits in perfectly with this definition and what we're talking about, is that it's usually not a coincidence. There's a reason why certain communities get targeted. And actually, if you go on to the next slide, I guess that's when we were going to have more discussion. But yeah, I'm curious if there are other parts of Hallandale Beach where you might have less investment, for example. I know we've already talked about some areas, but any other specific examples?
Well, the next lowest income of the 4 quadrants would be the Southwest. That's where the elementary and middle school were placed. There's, mobile home areas in that area, pretty large still. The city has bought some, like Peter Blueston Park almost doubled when we redid it last year, and that's because over the years the city bought up adjacent property that was mobile home properties and kind of banked it until we were ready to redevelop our central park. But Southwest is probably next in line as far as socioeconomic and has those kind of things as well. I don't know environmentally in the Southwest, again, it's adjacent to 95. You have that and stuff. So.
I'm sorry, my dog is angry.
I think it was somebody's puppy.
Boxer. And then my husband's trying to call her away. Work from home, right? We've all been there.
Mm-hmm.
Miss Faith, you've unmuted.
Oh, sorry. Nope, didn't mean to. It's just very interesting what we're talking about. Look, I'd never thought about that type of environmental justice and injustice. And gosh, if anything I've taken out of this was a couple of things, but that's really powerful. So thank you.
It's a conversation that's not often had, so I'm glad that we're talking about it.
Yeah, it never even entered in my mind, which is really sad. It just never did. It just never had. So, okay, thanks.
No, thank you. I think that's a really important point. I think, this is something that I learned about in school, but that was because I was in the public health field. That's what I did for undergrad. And then I pursued a master's degree in this. And so we often talk about like environmental health impacts. And so when we talk about that, this is often where there's been a lot of research done. Like the previous slide mentioned, that statistical fact is that a lot of like public health researchers look into this, and like their job is to see like where are the health disparities, why are certain areas impacted over others, and oftentimes it boils down to this issue of environmental injustice or environmental racism, where you have areas like a really famous example too is in New York City, if anyone's from New York, or the area where you have like Harlem and then the Upper East Side, which Upper East Side is known to be really wealthy. And Harlem isn't, and is lower income, people of color, and literally neighborhoods just right next to each other. There's not really a defined boundary, but in Harlem, you have people that live in much like older housing. There's more asthma related impacts there by like 2 times or more when you compare it to the Upper East Side. And so we start to boil it down and like see what are the differences. It's like their race and the kind of housing that they live in and the kind of economic means that they have, and do they have access to healthcare? Like oftentimes all of these issues build off of one another. But yeah, it's something that we don't talk about nearly enough, and I think it can get uncomfortable for sure. I think to have these conversations, and when you start to question like why things look a certain way or why certain communities have something over others, but I think definitely the first step is to know about it and know what this is, and then start to ask those questions. Because I think the more that you all do that, the more that, let's say there is a future plant or landfill, whatever it is that's being proposed, if we have people like you that show up to these meetings and start to ask questions about that, then we can avoid this happening in the future. So it's super important. This is such a good first step for all of you, because I think as soon as I think this is probably one of like the most enlightening parts of the presentation, is that as soon as like you're aware of it, now you're going to be looking and driving through your neighborhood and seeing like, wait, why is that school near this? Or like, why is the bus lot like near this area and stuff like that? And then you can start to work against that.
And this is something that makes my job really interesting and very difficult at the same time. We looked at that sea level rise map, and you see that the city needs to put a whole lot of investment in the eastern part to be able to make it so that people can remain here and we can have the services and the level of service. But knowing that other parts that aren't going to impact buildings but are going to impact people are not on that map. And how do we parse out the funding that's available, the resources, the time? That buildings are easy to say, we're going to lose this much tax revenue and then we will have to cut services this much. It's harder to be able to deal with those more intangible impacts of climate as people's health, people's long-standing inability to live in a clean environment and being their area being polluted disproportionately. It definitely complicates my work because I want to take care of everybody with what I'm doing, and I want to make sure that the funding that we have allocated serves all of the residents. And it's something that I've grappled with because one is much easier to put on a map than others. And I'm going to take care of everybody as best I can. But it's definitely some added complexity that gives me pause.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a very complicated issue. But we can kind of skip over this one since we've already kind of talked about it, and I know we're running out of time. This is just a really quick example. Another example that's more local to all of us, but this is in Bell Glades, and we've been talking about the sugar burning and near Lake Okeechobee, but this is a low-income majority African American neighborhood that has to deal with this, on a constant basis because of the way that our sugar production works, and that's just another case of something that shouldn't be happening, and people are definitely feeling the impacts. From the burning that takes place. It's definitely not a healthy environment to live in.
Especially under COVID conditions when you have particulate matter in the air, and that makes it harder for you to be able to deal with the disease.
Absolutely. And then something else, I touched upon this earlier, but I mentioned that for me at least, like my utility bills have been going up. I have coworkers that I've talked to and they're like, what the heck? Like, why is my bill so much higher than usual? And so with the pandemic, really everything has gone heightened really. And something that's a huge issue is that poorer families tend to also pay a higher percentage of their income on electricity. So you might be wondering why is that the case? So typically, if you think about the kinds of homes that poorer families might live in, it's usually older housing. It might be less insulated. It might have drafty windows. I know I live in like a newer building, and so I have this like fancy app that connects to my AC. So if I'm not home, I can, have the temperature be higher, save energy that way. Like there's all these cool, gizmos and gadgets that can help you. But if you have someone that's lower wealth, makes less money, these, they might live in older housing, they might have less energy efficient housing. So that's why they end up paying like a higher proportion of their income on electricity because of that. Because even if they have the AC on, if they have, a drafty window, they have to still keep it going longer or have cooler temperature to make up for that. And it's something that right now it's a huge issue because we're all expected to stay home. And unfortunately, if you're expected to stay home, you can't go to the mall maybe to get relief. You can't go to school. You can't go to some of these publicly available places to be able to get away from the heat. And so that's a huge issue too. And oftentimes it is people of color. It's the same people we've been talking about. Oftentimes you start to sound like a broken record, but it's really unfortunate that the same populations are feeling the impacts of COVID on top of climate change at the same time. Super downer, I know. But in the last moments that we have together, this is where I said we're going to get more into the solutions and leave on a positive note, because there's many things you can do. The fact that you're on this call is an important first step for all of this. So I just really love this quote. Naomi Klein, if you're really bored and need something to do at home and want to read more about this, Naomi Klein's a fantastic author. She's really well known in the climate change world for her awesome writing about these issues. She does just a really good job of connecting why this all matters, and also giving some tangible solutions for what you can do. So she's just a really great author. But I really like this term that she uses, which is transformational resilience. So what she points out is that the real solutions that we're talking about for the climate crisis are also our best hope for building a much more stable and equitable economic system, one that strengthens and transforms the public sphere, generates plentiful, dignified work, and radically reins in corporate greed. So just to break that down really quickly, what she's getting at is that, we'll talk about this later, but the solutions that we're talking about, like solar energy, for example, wind energy, these things that, like the sun, the wind, things that are, we can't really grab them, right? They're not tangible in that sense. They can really help to basically like even the playing field. If we're able to have access to like cheaper energy, for example, those energy burden homes that I talked about in the last slide, like they wouldn't have to worry about that right now. They'd be able to turn on their AC, not have to put their health on the line, and not fall behind on their bills. If they were able to have access to solar panels just on the roof and not have to worry about the cost that goes into it because it's affordable. It's just, you know, in a way, climate change, yes, there's a lot of issues and a lot of things we have to address, but a lot of the solutions, if we do them right, can actually really help us to create a society that like we all are really proud of to live in, and can help us create a safer, healthier environments for all of us to live in. So I touched on these earlier, but something important to walk away with too is knowing the difference between adaptation and mitigation. So this is part of the solutions that we're talking about. So adaptation, we're really talking about, we're adapting to the effects of climate change. So we already know, for example, in Hallandale, we talked about this, in Hallandale Beach, that there's already flooding issues that are happening. We have king tide events that are already happening. So we have to deal with those now. We just can't like hope that that'll go away. That's something that will be persistent for you all and where you live. So we have to think about solutions in order to make it easier for people to live with the water there. So that's why you have awesome people like Alyssa and on the city that are working on infrastructure changes and ways to adapt to these coming changes. But then on the flip side, there's also mitigation, which is addressing the actual causes of climate change. So we have to adapt to what's already happening, but also how can we diminish the amount of pollution that we're putting out into the atmosphere? Because just adapting will not get us super far in the future when we're talking about, you know, what did I say? Like it was like 40 to 70 inches of sea level rise by 2070. If we're not doing something to diminish that and minimize those impacts and adaptation, there's only so much, like, are we gonna keep raising our houses every year? We can't do that, right? It's not sustainable. So that's why it's really important when we're talking about solutions to talk about adapting, but also mitigating. And I think that's a rut that a lot of our cities do fall under, at least definitely here in Miami. I won't speak for Hallandale Beach because I don't live there, but I know here sometimes I get frustrated because we talk a lot about adaptation, but sometimes we don't talk about mitigation often enough. And it gets really frustrating because, like I said, we need to be thinking about those longer term impacts and how we can minimize those as much as possible.
For Hallandale Beach, we're just starting the discussion on both. essentially at the same time, because we realize that they're interconnected and we'll have to spend a whole lot more for adaptation if we don't mitigate. But the downside of the mitigation is that it's not just us who needs to mitigate, because the whole world shares the atmosphere. So we are going to do our best. We passed a resolution, or the commission passed a resolution over a year ago, committing to the IPCC 1.5 degrees Celsius, basically the Paris Agreement, but then a little bit more, to become, I'm saying lots of jargon here, to cut our emissions all the way by 2055. That's our goal, because that's what science tells us we have to do. But if we do that and no one else does that, the impacts will be lesser, for sure. But we're still doing it because that's the right thing.
Yes, absolutely. That's not an excuse to not do the right thing, and that's also why it's really important for, like, as a region, the fact that we have the climate change compact that's talking about the issues. That's why it's important for all of us to work on this together. I think oftentimes, and I think we've been seeing this a lot, especially with coronavirus, we tend to think in very selfish ways as a whole. And I think hopefully what we're getting out of this too, and talking about climate change, that it is a really big issue, but if all of us play a part, like individuals to communities to like state government to the federal government, then it starts to get a lot more manageable to deal with.
And something that I always like to bring up, we have power to do the right thing in our lives, and we should do the right thing in our lives, but 90% of the world's emissions are from 77 companies. So they have to do the right thing too. The private sector definitely has to do the right thing, and we have to pressure them to do the right thing.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, I unfortunately cut out this awesome slide that like has that completely depicted, like all the major fossil fuel companies. But yes, that's a very, thank you for bringing that back. Getting to some of the awesome solutions. Just keeping an eye on time. We have talked about trees already, so I won't go more into that, but just know that, I know Nico mentioned the fact that they provide shade, for example. So if you live somewhere where it tends to get really hot, if you have trees around that provide shade, you might have to use your AC less, for example, and that, contributes to, having less emissions that you're putting out because of using electricity, for example, if we're not connected to like solar power, of course. But yeah, and trees also, like, they're just nice to look at. Like they provide really great mental health impacts. It's nice to walk around if you have shaded canopy and all of that. I know that we get a lot of flack in South Florida for having palm trees versus like other more shady trees. Because palm trees, they really, like, I mean, they're nice to look at, but they don't provide all that much shade. But if we had trees that, even like fruit bearing trees, for example, they can provide fruit for people. And also, yes, palm trees are grass and not trees. There's just a lot of misconceptions around them. They look nice, but they when we boil down to it, they're not as helpful as other types of trees. So that's one thing that you can like advocate for and ask for. And also, it's not as expensive as other solutions that we're talking about. Public transit is huge, especially if we can find ways to electrify transit or move away from diesel and all of that. The more that people use public transit to get around, the less people you have driving in cars. Just bringing it back to that picture of people stuck in traffic. I know I used to live in New York City, and I was horrified when I moved to Miami and realized that there was just no way for me to do my job effectively, which I found really ironic. I'm working on climate change issues, but I have to drive around to do it. It was really frustrating to come to that realization. There was just no way for me to do it with public transit. I would be pulling my hair out. But those are things that we can continue to advocate for and to ask for. It's big investments, but if you think about the longer term impacts and how much money it would save people, like how much money like do we all spend on gas, on our insurance, and even then like the headaches that we all go through trying to get around, that those are things that we can push our local governments to do. Along the same lines, there's also solar panels. Florida is a sunshine state. I like to point that out often. We're a really great candidate when it comes to having great access to solar power here because of how sunny it does get. And I'll just add that for solar panels, like they've made them now so that they're strong enough to withstand hurricanes. So like if you think that they might be flimsy or anything like that, they're created to be able to withstand, you know, debris and all of that hitting them. It is still kind of expensive, but the pricing has gone down, and that's why it's really important at the state level, especially, to advocate and ask and to push for policies that allow for greater access to solar. Because, for example, I live in an apartment building, so I mean, I can try to get my building to put solar, but it's easier if the city or, you know, the state has ways of incentivizing that for renters, for example, or for people who live in apartment buildings. Oftentimes for solar power, it comes down to those that live in homes. The programs we have in place would be great to have some wider reaching programs so that we all can benefit from a solar system. I know, Alyssa, you probably have more to add on that.
So Faith is asking some questions about why green. So we do have PACE financing within the city and the county to make it so that you don't have to pay for your solar up front. You can attach it to your mortgage essentially and pay it over 30 years. The Broward Solar Co-op just opened another year today. So if you want, it doesn't cost anything to sign up, but that will make it so that you can get competitively priced bulk pricing for solar, bought and installed. And you can get solar arrays for one, like your air conditioning, like you're saying, Faith, or for your whole house. You can scale it to whatever size you want. And then I'm a renter, for example, and although it's not totally up and running yet, FPL has a program, Solar Together, that you can sign up and basically get renewable energy credits. They will build solar with your money and give you like this paper that says that it's solar. It's probably not solar that comes to you from the transmission lines, but you're creating solar, you pay just a little bit extra. I think for me to do my entire apartment, it's an extra $1 or $2 a month to be able to get the renewable energy credits that say that I'm getting all of my energy from solar. Essentially, it's less than ideal, but for those of us in multifamily, there's no way that we could put enough solar on any rooftop for multifamily housing to be able to generate enough electricity for that condo or that apartment building. So this is the option that we have right now. And for solar, there's a page on the city's website where you can get all of the information on how to go through the permitting process. And we have a shorter, more streamlined permitting process for solar because we want people to do it.
Absolutely. And I think when we talk about, we haven't talked about resilience too much, but if you think about, if a storm happens, I know some people actually did lose their power during the storm, but if you're able to rely on like your own array, for example, of solar panels, then you don't have to worry about what FPL is doing because you have your own power there that's like hooked up to a battery and stuff like that. There's a lot more you could talk about clean energy, which we unfortunately don't have time for, but definitely like Alyssa's a great resource. I'm also happy to provide whatever I can in terms of that, but it's definitely something to look into. And the last,
No, I was just hoping you were going to get to the mangroves.
Oh yeah, no, of course, the mangroves are like awesome. So mangroves are really great natural barrier and another great solution. So we do have some mangroves, that naturally exist, and there's different groups that are working on restoring them and planting or putting more down. But mangroves have been proven when it comes to storm surge that happens from hurricanes, for example. They're a really great barrier and basically provide protection from us so that the storm surge is having less of an impact on those that are right like on the coast. So it's a natural infrastructure solution. It provides wildlife habitat to be in. It's nice to look at. So I know I personally love when we're able to incorporate green ways of solving these issues because they have so many co-benefits. You'll probably hear that, but co-benefits in the sense that they're providing more shade, maybe they're providing cleaner air or cleaner environment, so your health is better. They might improve your mental health because it's nice to like have areas to walk through to go see like wildlife. It improves your mental health, and then it's also helping us with climate change and making that less of an issue. So there's so many win-wins there. So I think it's important to think about ways that we can use solutions that provide multiple benefits, because you get more bang for your buck, which I think we all know sometimes these things come down to money and how much access we have. So it's great when we're able to pick solutions that tick off a lot of boxes. So just really quickly, because we're running out of time, but this is a really great example of adapting and mitigating. So this is adapting in the sense that you have a parking lot, and you have cars parked here, and we've all gone into cars where you put your seatbelt on and then it burns you because it's so hot in there, you can't touch the steering wheel. But if you have shaded infrastructure like this, then it makes that less of an issue. But also, what's really cool, if you have some setup like this, if you have an electric car, then you can plug into the solar array, and then you're in an electric vehicle, you're not emitting anything, so you're adapting and mitigating in this scenario. So when we're thinking about what the future can look like, it can look something like this, where we're adapting and mitigating at the same time. And then another thing I'd like to point out is that there's a lot of people that care about this issue. I know sometimes it feels really isolating, or like there aren't groups that are working on this, but like I started my PowerPoint, there's many groups down here that are working on fighting this issue from different angles, from the health angle, from the infrastructure angle, from working with different immigrant groups that might be feeling the impacts more. So I just like to show this picture because I think there's definitely power in numbers, and the fact that you all are here, now you have a better sense of what's happening in your own backyard. So now you're much better equipped now to be able to go out into your communities, have conversations around this, and to advocate for solutions that make sense for you and your family and your neighbors. So in the last few minutes, just want to go to the next slide. And is this still, you have the Google PowerPoint version?
I can open that instead. This is the PowerPoint.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, we can also just like verbally do it if that's quicker. But I just wanted quickly to end on a positive note, like I said, and just like brainstorm really quickly, like individual or community-wide actions that we all can take to work on these issues. So you've heard some solutions, you heard some of the issues. So what are ways that you individually or within your community can start to fight these issues?
I think there's so many ways. Sometimes it's like little bits, but it's hard to wrap your head around that your little bits will help, So for us, like when we're designing parks, we're looking at we're putting electric vehicle chargers, we're looking at a solar system in one of the biggest parks and looking at it that way. And it's baby. I think it's baby steps for each of us, and it'll amount to a bigger effort.
Absolutely.
I mean, I can list off what I do, but I'll let other people speak first.
We'd be here till 10 o'clock.
Okay. Well, I'd like to say that the solar panels, even if it's just for air conditioning, to investigate that. I mean, that seems to be the majority of the bill that most people have, I think. So that's something I would like to investigate more about. And then I wonder, even with the condo buildings, I don't know anything about solar, but some of these condo buildings where they have, hundreds of people living inside, is there a way to set something up, and be more effective? I don't know anything about it, and just, it gets your mind thinking, about all the effects. And the seawall situation with what the city is doing, and Alyssa had mentioned that it's going to be a county mandated, but they're going to do it in layers and have different ways to make it affordable for people. Just because I live on the east, and just because I live in the east, I was just fortunate, at the time 37 years ago, to buy where I live, which is one of the premier areas in the Hallandale, probably because it's on the water. However, 37 years ago, it was $200,000, and I'm not one of the big mansions. So, even though we live east, we could be prejudiced, not prejudiced, but we're still on fixed income, some of us, so it's really interesting to look at that aspect and how to make it affordable so we can continue, all of us living the way we want to live and do what's best for our environment. And yeah, so it's all been very interesting. Thank you.
Anybody else? What can you do?
Radio silence.
I was going to say that I definitely connected with what I think it was Kathy that you mentioned, that it feels like can be really overwhelming. Some of the advice that I give people that are new to this space or are just wrapping their head around it is to think about the things that you really care about. Because I think no matter how you dice this issue, climate change has such far-reaching impacts. We scratched the surface today in 2.5 hours about the many impacts that there are. But let's say, for example, that you are really interested in art, for example. That's your thing, and you're like, how do I connect this to climate change? I have friends here that are artists and that see this as a really big issue, and they found really cool ways to use art to communicate that and to make really awesome installations that show the impacts we're expected to see. So that's one way. Or let's say that you're really passionate about fighting for women's rights, and that's something that you really care about. Well, we didn't talk about this too much, we didn't have time today, but climate change can disproportionately impact women. They typically carry the burden when it comes to the impacts. So if you really care about women, then if you broaden your scope a little bit, you can also work on climate change issues. So that's why I say it's a really intersectional issue. So I think sometimes it's just if you just start from that one point of the things you really care about, oftentimes they're impacted by climate change. So you can start from there. And also know that we're all working on this. There's different groups, like I mentioned, that are tackling this from different ways, and we're not expecting one person to solve all the issues or to work on all of them at once. It's just starting from somewhere and then going from that point forward.
In the ilk of the political advocacy actions, I always appreciate it when members of the public come and support things that I'm trying to get pushed through commission, adopted or approved through commission, as well as residents pushing me beyond what I'm already asking for. Tell me that you want something. I had a resident who asked for a climate emergency proclamation. Push me. Please push me. I have ideas, and sometimes I am used to compromising, so push me. Don't be afraid. Support what's out there. Push me to do better, push your elected officials, state, local, federal, to do better. We definitely need that. Make sure that there's the vote with your fork, not necessarily always with your fork, but with your fork, spend money in a way that supports the climate action that you want to see. Support businesses that are actively working to reduce their emissions, to take care of people who have been disadvantaged. There's so many different things that you could do. One that I get a lot from residents is that they think recycling can solve the problem. That's a first step, but it definitely is not enough. So work on your waste, the way you consume. Try to get solar if you can. If you can't, maybe think about that FPL program for a portion of your electricity bill. It doesn't have to be the whole thing. There's all sorts of things that we can do. Change the way you eat. It doesn't have to be that you go straight up vegan. I'm sure many of our commissioners would appreciate that, but even eliminating meat out of a couple meals of your day, 1 or 2, can have a tremendous impact, or going for the meatless Monday and just not having meat on Monday. There's so many different things that we can do.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, it's something that we do. So I haven't had time to talk about this, but we have a climate leadership training program called CLEAR. And so we talk about this for 10 weeks. So like I said, we scratch the surface here, but we spent 10 weeks, once a week for 3 hours talking about this and going really deep into many of the things we talked about today. But one of the things that we encourage our participants to do is to think about this like in the individual level, community level, and then like political or advocacy level. And I think it's really important to start from the individual starting point and think about what you can do. But we also try to push our participants, because oftentimes people get stuck on like, kind of like Alyssa was saying, like, I have my metal straw, which is great. It's good to do that. But I think it's also knowing that like in broad numbers that we can have such a big impact on what our elected officials are doing, or what our local government is doing. So I think, you know, Alyssa's a really great resource. She's really open. I think paying attention, for example, to what like upcoming commission meetings are happening. Oftentimes you'd be surprised how little they get attendance from community members. So even if you just have like you and 4 of your friends show up, that can have such a huge impact. Like you'd be surprised the number of times I've seen just a few people pop up, and then that completely like change the tide, pun intended, of what solutions are being proposed, whether they're good or bad. So yeah, I really encourage you all to think in that way, and, you know, start having these conversations with your family, with your community, with those you work with. And yeah, just find those points where people care, and whether that's from the health angle, whether that's from like the money angle, from the national security angle. You know, there's different ways to start to connect the dots for people. But yeah, we're almost out of time. I don't know if anyone else had any like last minute comments they wanted to provide about this in particular, different actions we can all take.
No, but thank you for doing this. It's very informative.
Of course. So just to wrap things up, we wanted to just point out that the City of Hallandale Beach does have a climate action plan that they put together, which is really awesome. This is hyperlinked as well in the presentation. And I told Alyssa that you guys are more than happy to have access to it, so you can take a look. And there's like resources too, like you can click around in the slides, and there's deeper into that you can get to if you want to do more research now. But they have an awesome survey where they're trying to get your input, which is great. So definitely a great next step would be to take a look. And now you have more information, you can do more research, you can ask Alyssa questions. And you can give them feedback about what they're planning to do for you all in the future. I think that's a really great initial way to get involved in all of this. And Alyssa, I'm sure you have more to add about it.
Sure. So like I said, we're approaching adaptation and mitigation at the same time. And I can come up with the ideas that I have, but I can't come up with the bright ideas that you all have. And there are many different ways that we can approach this, and many different facets of the problem that we can approach, and different co-benefits that might be more valuable to you than would be to just a general person. So I know many of you on the call already have taken the Climate Action Plan survey, but if you haven't, please do. So it's my birthday in 2 days, and I'm hoping that I can get 100 responses to this by that day. So I only need, I think it's 3 more. So tell your friends, give me a birthday present of climate action input, if you're willing. But this will make it so that it's made by all of us. The actions that we take won't just be my ideas, because I am not solely Hallandale Beach. We're all Hallandale Beach. I don't even live in Hallandale Beach. So honestly, it should be mostly your ideas. I have some expertise to add to it, but I want to make sure that this is not made in a vacuum, that the actions that we take are things that you want, things that you care about, things that will give you the benefits that you want from your community. So please, it takes about 15 minutes. I can send out the link, or you can go to cohb.org/green, and then there's a big button at the top, and you click on that and it'll bring you to the survey itself. 15 minutes makes a big difference. It'll make it so that we're doing what you want instead of what I think you want. And it's always best to be upfront about that. So please provide your input.
Yes, I totally agree. Provide input, make Alyssa's birthday awesome. And I think just the last thing we'll say, I know we're over a minute, but is that, you know, oftentimes people get really scared talking about these issues, and they feel like, well, if I'm not a meteorologist or I'm not a climate scientist, I'm not an expert. But something that we really try to lead with our work is that we're all living through these issues, we're all living through these impacts. Your lived experience, that is expertise that you bring. You'd be surprised, you know, the number of times that, like, you know, maybe like the Army Corps of Engineer, you know, comes to a neighborhood and says, like, these are things that we need to see done. But if you've been living there for like number of years, you probably have a much better sense of like what the changes have been, like where the specific flooding might be happening, or where like in a specific corner, you know, the neighborhood can benefit from like trees or whatever it is. Like, you live there, that's your neighborhood. You know, so I always encourage people to really own that lived experience and the things that you go through and the things that you've seen, because that matters. When Alyssa's talking about input and thinking about solutions, oftentimes community members have the ideas and have the right solutions in mind that will have the greatest impact for your own community. So I'll just leave you all with that, and thank you so much for, you know, spending this evening with us. I know it's a long day for us, especially those that like might be working on Zoom a lot or whatever platform that is that you're on. So I think this is amazing. I'm really glad that we got to do this, and thank you, Alyssa, for putting this together. I'll definitely share my contact information with her, and she can share it out with you all if you have any questions and want to know more about the work that we're doing specifically. But I think you're in really good hands with Alyssa. Definitely take advantage of that, because you don't always have Alyssas that are, you know, so readily available to talk with you about these issues. So definitely take advantage of that. And yeah, we're all in this together. So hopefully this wrapped up in a positive note, and know that, you know, there's definitely things we can do to solve these issues.
And I just want to say thank you to everybody who came out tonight, again, taking time out of your evening, could have been free time, to come and learn about this challenge that faces the city. And I always say community is my favorite word. It's my favorite concept. And we can't do this without all of us taking this community effort and learning about this and approaching it together in ways that you want. So thank you, everybody, for joining.
Absolutely. Thank you all.
Right. Have a lovely rest of your evening. If you'd like the recording of this, just email me, contact me, and we'll be having a second version of this if you want to bring some friends on the 26th.
And you'll know all the answers to all the questions.
Yes, yeah, you could be the smartest person in the room, in the virtual room.
Thank you both. Appreciate it.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everybody. Bye.
Bye.
Good night.
Bye.
Good night.